Okay, excellent. Thank you for those that are able to be here. I'm just going to jump right into it, given the short time. This is joint work with Temu Yi and Jing Zhang. So like in most of the literature on structural change, we're going to be thinking about the three broad sectors, and specifically the decline in agriculture's share with income per capita, the rise in services, and then the rise and eventual decline in manufacturing share. As you know, these patterns are so deeply ingrained in the development process that they almost feel like they're physical laws of nature. However, the dynamics do seem to be changing over time, and with each successive country's experience in going through the development process. And so we're going to be thinking about these changing dynamics in a global environment. And in the rest of the talk, I'm going to specifically zoom in and focus on the manufacturing sector, and we're going to measure its share in GDP. That's going to be our primary measure. And throughout, I'm going to be focusing on a sample of 28 countries from.
So Michael, are you moving slides? We only see your first slide.
Not yet.
Okay.
I'm on the title slide still. So here's the first slide. Thanks, Diego. Yeah, you did see it change, right? Okay, perfect. So yeah, looking at our sample, 28 countries, 1971 to 2011. So first, we're going to sort of confirm evidence of deindustrialization, a fact that was first documented by Danny Roderick. So deindustrialization includes the observation that countries are successively attaining lower and lower peak manufacturing shares in their GDP or employment. And essentially, one way to think about it is they're effectively bypassing manufacturing and transitioning straight from agriculture to services. So to sort of, formalize this, what we do is we regress sector value added share on income per capita for our panel of countries, as well as income per capita squared. And we include country fixed effects, and then we allow the coefficients on income per capita and income per capita squared to differ in the pre versus post 1990 period. We then use those estimates to kind of construct a arbitrary path for a median country, what it would look like as its income progresses. And clearly what you see in the left panel of the figure is that the pre-90 path is much higher than the post-90 path. The interpretation is that countries that kind of go through the industrialization process later are going to, sort of have lower manufacturing shares and attain a lower manufacturing peak share. So this deindustrialization fact is about the first moment, right? The expected path that a country is going to follow. So the second fact that's new that we're going to introduce is about the second moment. And what does the dispersion in these manufacturing shares look like across countries? That's in the right panel, and as you can see here, this dispersion in manufacturing shares has risen about doubled from 1970 to 2011, and most of that increase happened in a post-90 period, which we already know this is a period where globalization really onset in large force. So the aim of this paper is to explore drivers of both of these phenomena simultaneously. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a dynamic model that features structural change, trade through Ricardian forces, capital accumulation, and input output linkages. In our model, there's going to be two key exogenous kind of driving forces that induce structural change.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Of course.
The second fact you got, is that for the full set of cross-country panels, or is that for the ones that have already gone past the peak?
This is for our full set of countries.
Okay. I haven't heard that before, so I was curious.
Yeah. So going back to the model, we're going to have two key driving forces. They're going to induce structural change, and they're going to be mediated through various mechanisms that include income and price effects, in addition to comparative advantage and investment dynamics. And the first exogenous force is going to be technological progress, specifically asymmetric productivity growth across the different sectors. And the second driving force is going to be declining trade costs. So it's going to kind of capture increased globalization or trade integration over time. We're going to calibrate both of these processes to jointly match prices and bilateral trade flows that we observe at the sector level for each country in each time period. Okay. So before jumping into the results, I'll just mention that our baseline matches the primary facts very well, including targets that we didn't specifically target, or including moments that we didn't specifically target, including the sectoral shares and all the structural change related features. They're not moments that we directly targeted, but the model matches them well. So then what we do is we're going to use the model as kind of a laboratory to, to explore the quantitative significance of both of these drivers and contributing to the structural change in deindustrialization and industry polarization facts. And so now let me talk about the counterfactuals. Here, I'm going to look at two of them. And the first one, we're just going to think about autarky, right? We kind of want to see, what's the role of trade? When you remove trade, what's left is asymmetric productivity growth. So we'll look at the left panel. So we're just going to set trade costs prohibitively high, and we're going to allow technology or productivity to sort of evolve the same way as in our baseline model. And so in the left panel, what we see is, the dashed lines correspond to these synthetic paths in the counterfactual. And, we see a decline in peaks, even in the autarky scenario. And that decline in peaks is about 2 percentage points. If you compare it to the baseline, which is the solid curves, that decline was about 3.5 percentage points. So basically, our interpretation of this is that asymmetric productivity growth alone, which is the only driving force in this counterfactual scenario, that force alone contributes about 60% to deindustrialization as measured by the gap between peaks. Okay. On the flip side of that is, we shut down asymmetric productivity growth and we allow for trade integration as in the baseline model. So what we do here, we call this constant relative productivity, or CRP. And what's going on here is for each country, we're going to eliminate sector bias technology growth and just choose one sector neutral productivity path for each country. And it's going to be chosen so that this counterfactual model delivers similar income dynamic, or the same income dynamics as in the baseline model. So what you see here is that, the dash curves now, this is in the right panel, they lie basically right on top of one another. So this basically says that, this trade integration alone, which is the only driving force taking place in this scenario, contributes nothing on its own to deindustrialization. And now by induction, the interaction of these two forces accounts for the remaining 40%. Okay, and I'll come back to the intuition on that interaction effect a little bit later on. But let me first talk about the implications for industry polarization. And I'll just mention this very briefly. So that's the solid curve is the baseline, and this dotted curve that kind of shoots above it, this is the scenario where we have trade integration, but constant relative productivity growth. So basically trade integration is the key driver of this increased dispersion of manufacturing activity across countries. So let me just mention the intuition now for each of these results. So in our model, what's going on? So productivity growth is more pronounced in manufacturing than it is in services. And this is a typical observation across many countries. And in addition to that, trade costs have declined significantly faster in manufacturing than in other sectors. Okay, so these two forces combined deliver a decline in the relative price of manufacturing to services globally, right? So it's not specific to just a few countries here and there. These are both global phenomena. In addition to that, our estimated price elasticities or Baumol elasticities, they're less than 1 across various components. In fact, every component of spending, which includes various components of final demand, as well as intermediate demand. Those are all less than 1. So as the relative price of manufacturing is declining globally, later industrializers are facing a lower and lower relative price of manufacturing and consequently attaining lower and lower manufacturing shares in spending and hence in value added. Okay. Now I previously mentioned that trade alone didn't seem to do much for deindustrialization, but the interaction effect did. And what we find is the key intuition here is that trade facilitates kind of an amplification mechanism, in that if I'm trading with you, the prices that I'm facing, in some sense, I'm kind of inheriting the relative price dynamics that you're generating through your asymmetric technology paths in addition to my own. So trade is kind of facilitating this amplification mechanism that's contributing to these relative price movements domestically And that's occurring through international trade. And so that's where trade becomes important for thinking about the industrialization. Now, in terms of industry polarization, the logic, I think, is just much more straightforward. And first order is that, lower trade costs allow for a greater concentration of production globally to take place in fewer and fewer countries, to supply the rest of the world. And this is going to result in increased dispersion of manufacturing activity. So essentially, once we've uncovered these mechanisms using the model, we provide some empirical evidence that directly supports each of the various mechanisms. So I'll stop here and use whatever time is left to answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. If anyone does have any questions, Hagen, brilliant.
Yes, I really like your paper, and thanks for the presentation. I have a question on the interpretation of your findings, because I think on the technical side, there's nothing to discuss there. But how much do you actually speak to late industrializers with your data? Because I was looking at the list of countries that are among those 28 that you use to derive those stylized facts or estimate the model. There's not a single African country in there in the sample, and the large majority of those countries are actually OECD countries, so developed countries that already had the peak. So that also links to Joe's comment, right? How much deindustrialization is actually still going on in countries in sub-Saharan Africa or low-income Asian countries? So how realistic are those findings actually for late industrializers today still? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Hagen. This is a good question. I mean, so, what we could say about countries that haven't attained their peak yet, obviously it's going to require a bit of speculation or extrapolation based on what we've learned from the model. But here, most of the countries, not all of them, have already attained their peak, but we do have quite a bit of dispersion in the years that, countries have reached their peak, right? So we can see that, reaching your peak later corresponds to having a lower peak. And there's a few countries in here, like, in Southeast Asia or India and Indonesia that, either are only reaching their peak or haven't, gotten all the way there yet. But in terms of countries that haven't really even taken off and formed, or become an industrialized nation as, we would define it, say, by, the IMF's definition or something like that, we don't capture any of those countries. So that, as I said, making claims about that might require a bit more extrapolation from what we have actually learned here. So.
Emmanuel, I have a question.
I have a question.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for the nice presentation, and this is a really nice paper. I have a quick question. In the paper, you define manufacturing sector as manufacturing, mining, and utilities. And in one of your key mechanisms, relative price of manufacturing leads to the quantitative outcomes. And what I see is that the presumption is that how prices relate with TFP, sector bias TFP in manufacturing is the same. You presume that it's the same as mining and utilities, but I can say that this could be very different, right? So how do you control for some of these distortions? Think about some developing countries where utilities is state-owned monopolies.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, it's not something we've specifically disaggregated further to say anything about it. I think, for the majority of the countries that we have, which includes OECD and a couple Latin American countries, and then, East Asian economies, that most of the components of the manufacturing sector are kind of the traditional manufacturing assembly type activities, accounting for, the majority of the share. I think I think the mining component may be that has more variation across locations, based especially, it's typically a small share in the Asian economies and a bit larger share in the Latin American economies. So, there might be something interesting to unpack there, but yeah, we haven't specifically done it.
Thank you. So yeah, Emmanuel has actually sort of asked one of my questions on the heterogeneity of the sectors in these different countries. So, how do you take that into account? So that's one. Even within manufacturing, depending on what kind of sectors you are, how does that affect your results? Now my second question is, what about trade policies? Like, for instance, in East Asian countries, vis-a-vis, say, South Asia or African countries, which may not be here, they have much more lower tariff rates, more open economies. So how did that affect, or how does that come into play? But let me add my also view. Very nice paper, insightful paper. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think in terms of the, you think about the trade costs, right? So there's certainly two dimensions on which you can think about, and we've explored a little bit, is kind of thinking about, you know, the kind of on the import side of having changing trade costs versus the export side, right? So is it becoming, am I able to deliver my goods to the market kind of, you know, more efficiently over time, or am I able to kind of, you know, import stuff, you know, and having a lower kind of wedge, whether it be due to tariffs or other kind of barriers? And what we find is it's an export margin of those trade costs that matter more for deindustrialization. And our interpretation is that, you know, basically just, you know, being able to get your stuff out to the, you know, out to the rest of the world more efficiently is gonna facilitate you to be able to develop a larger manufacturing sector as a whole. So that seems to be more closely related to the deindustrialization component than the import side of the trade costs.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. Are there any final questions or comments? If not, I think we'll be moving back to the main room soon for the last.
I have a last question.
Sure, go for, please.
I have a last question. Thank you. Nice paper. I just out of curiosity, Michael, like more like a question, self-serving, which is, if someone wanted to look at this, like Hagen asked for, like more like underdeveloped countries, what would be a good proxy right now for this world input-output database that you have that could try to do something like this?
Well, you know, I don't, in fact, so I'm working on another project right now where, you know, we're going to start looking into the GTAP database, which basically is input-output tables, global input-output, but for, you know, much larger swath of countries, including more lower income countries. I haven't, you know, gotten enough.
Maybe I'll send you an email then too.
Yeah, I think that's one place where you can look if you want to see these input-output linkages in lower income countries. Maybe, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the room will be closing soon, and we'll be back to the main room where you can choose your option for the final breakout room.
Thank you.